Since the Tsar's time, people were dreaming to build this bridge. At last, thanks to your hard work, your talent, this project, this miracle has happened.
Well, that's actually the explosion, but yes, the reminder that it was considered this sort of crown jewel, that he had been there for the final construction of it, and it eventually was destroyed. Now, Ukraine does not take formal credit for this, and we could sort of understand why they wouldn't do that. I guess it was just a coincidence. I guess someone else did it. They were just, there's chaos. I'm gonna jump in there and do something about this, but that was considered very serious. And it was also, look, it's terrible for any infrastructure like this to be blown up, but the logistic difficulties that the Russians have had from the very beginning, like this is exacerbating that. They don't appear to have great equipment, which was a bit of a surprise. They don't seem to be well trained in the use of the equipment, but more important than that, they didn't seem from the very beginning to give a damn about what was actually brought out in the field. They were just expected to find food, find medical supplies, even in the initial push, let alone some of the later conscription, the mass, waves of people who'd gotten 2 or 3 days of training with guns. So taking out a bridge like that was strategically probably a wise move.
Oh, it was wise. It was a brilliant move by the Ukrainians or whoever did it. But here's the other part about it. Russia responded with heavy bombardments of Ukrainian infrastructure. And I think that was also the moment when a lot of people feared, is this when Russia is going to start to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, to use their nukes to wipe out tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers? Because the fear was that, well, Russia has it, it's eventually going to use whatever weapons in its arsenal it needs to gain back its territory that it wants to claim. The fact that Russia did not do that it still has not used nuclear weapons, I think a lot of credit has to go to the Biden administration, to other world powers, which have been able to put enough pressure on Russia to say, okay, you can fight, but there's certain boundaries, there's certain things that we, the rest of the world, are not going to tolerate. And thankfully, Putin has not yet deployed nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and there was a lot of fear, when they were fighting around one of the nuclear power facilities. There were concerns about what might happen with that, and a lot of incredibly needlessly risky stuff being done around that. It is always felt to me like escalating this to the use of nuclear weapons right over the border from your country would be mad. But then again, invading it all was. So I understand the concerns ongoing about the use of weapons of mass destruction. I also, have to acknowledge that on a daily basis, some of the most intellectually dishonest people in American politics, like Marjorie Greene and Tucker Carlson, are using that threat, not just using that threat, asserting that is ultimately President Joe Biden's goal, that he desperately wants a nuclear war with Russia to justify whatever they want, stopping aid to Ukraine, a national divorce, locking up Hunter Biden, whatever it is. Joe Biden wants nuclear war, and so we should get whatever we want. That's been frustrated from the very beginning. I do want to just put a pin in our talk about how the war has moved back and forth over the territory of Ukraine with this very fascinating animated map of the changing battle lines. Yeah, so you could see that almost instantly a lot of territory was gained in just the first day or two of the war. And there have been big movements since then, but largely you've gotten more of a focus in the south and the east rather than some of the initial push into the north when Kyiv was the explicit target. And we're gonna have to see, they've talked about drafting up 1 million more soldiers or something like that. And so we'll see if that makes them more successful than some of their previous pushes into Ukraine. But I'm curious where you see this going forward. Like, I know it's difficult to predict, as we said, David, but any predictions for where we'll be when we recount the second year of this war?
Yeah, it is very hard to say, because on the one hand, you could make an argument that if Russia suddenly looked for an off ramp and decided, okay, we're going to pull back, you would be surprised by that, right? Because all they have is that little sliver essentially in eastern Ukraine that you just put up on the map. And this has been an abject failure for Russia. But can Vladimir Putin afford, because of his own internal politics, to essentially surrender and to give up on his dream of taking Ukraine back and making it part of Russia? And I'm not sure he can, and I'm not sure he will. So in my view, this keeps going. And I think you mentioned this could go on for years, maybe even decades. I think that's within the realm of possibility that this is essentially a war of attrition that Russia tries to fight, and Ukraine simply tries to hang in there, perhaps with a lot of support from the West. But I'm also so glad, John, that you mentioned the Tucker Carlsons and Marjorie Taylor Greens, because the other element about this is in the United States, one could argue that there are Russian agents, if not Russian agents, there are pro-Russian politicians in the United States who are saying this sort of crap about Joe Biden and about what Joe Biden wants. And I think in any other time, people would look at US politics and say, those people are insane. They need to be excommunicated from our political system. But in fact, they represent a growing number in the lunatic right-wing fringe of Republican politics of people who are pro-Russian, hate the idea that Biden has been helping Ukraine fight the Russians, and feel like there's some nefarious US conquering of Russia that is at hand here, which is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and they were just saying that recently. It would seem hard to make the case that this is a war against Russia, a conquering of Russia, when Russia started the war and attacked another country, invading it. They've found a way to make that case. I don't understand it. I've been advocating from the very beginning for Russia to just turn the tanks around, go back over the border. You'll lose nothing unless you stay. You'll keep losing stuff then. And you're right to point out that there are these like broad, vague political calculations being made by Putin. What a sick situation for us to be in, just as a people, as a collective human civilization, for those sorts of considerations to be worth tens of thousands of lives. Like that other people who might look up to you, who support you, they'll die so that you can save metaphoric face. A weird state to be in.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.